It was supposed to be a new axis of allies capable of challenging Western dominance. A collective of countries all influenced by Russia that Vladimir Putin could use to strengthen his threats against the West and jostle for what he sees as his rightful place at the head of the geopolitical table. Through carefully chosen alliances, Putin thought that he was slowly maneuvering himself into a position that would see Russia become the world's most dominant nation. Putin was wrong. Russia's leader has just endured a week from hell that has seen his allies drop like flies. First, it was Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Next up, Iran. The Iranian regime is collapsing as the country descends into chaos amidst massive protests. For over a week, Iran's regime has been forced to absorb a wave of protests sparked by anger over the country's failing economy, and it doesn't look like those protests are going to end anytime soon. According to the BBC, human rights activists claim that protests took place in 26 of Iran's 31 provinces during the week leading up to January 5th alone, and Iran hasn't been able to do much of anything to quell the mass outrage. Unfortunately, up to 35 people have died. However, this is far from the type of brutal put-down that the country's regime would have to carry out to forcibly silence its own people. These protests began on December 28th as Iranian shopkeepers flooded the streets of Tehran against the backdrop of the Iranian rial falling sharply in value against the US dollar. The currency has plunged to record lows, and it's done so at a time when inflation in Iran has risen as high as 40%, while sanctions implemented to halt Iran's nuclear program bite hard. Food inflation is higher, having hit 70%, and the BBC says the cost of other basic goods has rocketed up by as much as 110%. Soon after the shopkeepers took to the streets, university students and other anti-regime people joined them. The crowds chant slogans such as "Death to the Dictator," with these pointed words being aimed squarely at the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. These protests have shaken the Iranian regime to its very core, and that shaking is developing into a seismic event that has hit Khamenei and his cronies at a point when the country they lead is at the weakest it's been in several years. Corruption is also a major issue, as the BBC reports. High-profile corruption cases in Iranian courts involving senior officials and their families have reinforced public anger and the belief that parts of the ruling elite are exploiting the crisis, the outlet says. To the average Iranian, there seems to be a sense that some high-ranking officials are using sanctions to secure special deals that allow them to control imports, exports, and oil movement in what amounts to a form of money laundering that enriches those at the top while the average Iranian struggles. All of these pressures have been building for a long time. Now they've exploded in protests that threaten Khamenei's entire regime. This is far from the first time that the Iranian people have protested against their leaders. As Al Jazeera points out in a January 5th report, protests were rife following the Iranian Revolution, leading to thousands of people marching on the streets between 1979 all the way up to the late 1990s. Student and reformist protests took place in 1999 and into the early 2000s, which were then followed by protests by Iran's Green Movement in 2009 and 2010. The Mahsa Amini uprising, which began in 2022, sparked another wave of protests as infuriated Iranians voiced their anger about the death of Amini when she was in police custody. However, what we're seeing now, which are the worst protests since the Amini uprising, seems to be different. Some of the faces in the crowds may be the same as those seen in the years past, but Iran's regime no longer seems to have the power to shut down the people who are trying to rid themselves of Khamenei. Uprisings that have, in the past, led to deaths of hundreds and the arrests of many thousands more are now happening largely unabated. The big question is why? Iran International offered some potential answers in a January 2nd report, in which it highlighted how several experts believe that the protests have exposed a regime that is sliding toward a collapse. The outlet says that some of these experts believe that these protests will spark the slow erosion of the Khamenei regime's ability to govern, which will inevitably lead to the destruction of the entire system that Iran's supreme leader has built around himself. The trigger for that collapse will be the economic problems we've already covered. Danny Citranovich, who is the former head of the Iran branch of Israel's military intelligence, says that the Khamenei regime is hamstrung by its inability to find a way out of these economic woes. The main problem the regime has is that it has no silver bullet solution to the economic problems in Iran, Citranovich says. Any temporary fix implemented won't do much, as the problem will stay, the intelligence expert claims. Another expert, Alex Vatanka of the Middle East Institute, adds that the mood among Iran's elites also indicates that they don't have the appetite or capability to deal with what's happening on the streets. "I have certainly not ever seen this level of hopelessness inside the Iranian regime," Vatanka says. Such hopelessness may propel Iran even closer to regime change as the country's elite start jostling among themselves to settle internal rivalries, perhaps leading to mistakes that add further fuel to an already raging fire. A January 4th opinion piece by the Jerusalem Post's Daniel M. Rosen adds that Iran's regime has more than the country's economy to worry about. It says that the core ideological anchor that holds the regime in place is gone, and with it has followed the popular base and perhaps even the support of the Iranian military. This moment is akin to a false prophet whose promises of salvation have been proven empty. The Islamic Republic's government long justifies the extraordinary sacrifices demanded of its citizens, the blood and economic hardship, as contributions to a higher purpose, the advancement of Islamist ideology capable of destroying Israel and challenging the West, Rosen says. The problem? All of the sacrifices that Khamenei's regime asked for haven't been repaid. Iran is no more a challenger to the West than it was years ago. If anything, it's weaker, as demonstrated by both the country's economic hardships and Iran's utter failure to defend itself against joint Israeli and US airstrikes in 2025. Time and time again, the outlet argues, the Khamenei regime has proven its own claims fraudulent. Massive inflation may just be the straw that broke the back of a camel that was already buckling under the weight of false promises. But perhaps the biggest killer of any hope that Iran's regime has of a turnaround is that there appears to be no resolution for the economic issues that provoked the unrest we see now. At least that seems to be the collective opinion of those taking to the streets. That's according to University of Central Florida PhD student in political science Kasra Karadagi. Speaking to DW, he says, "In such a setting, when living costs rise but incomes and job security don't keep pace, livelihood grievances quickly turn into dissatisfaction. This economic crisis is unfolding in a context where public trust in the government's ability to control inflation and create stability has eroded. Broken trust is what it all boils down to." Khamenei has managed to avoid overthrow in the past despite his regime's many broken promises, but combine corruption with military weakness and economic pressures, and you get a series of broken promises in quick succession that have resulted in the patience of the Iranian people disappearing. Still, even with all of these issues, Iran's regime should still be able to do something, even if that something is cracking down on the protests with such force that they're destroyed. That would at least buy time and perhaps give Khamenei the ability to intimidate the Iranian people into submission. Only that isn't an option either, and the reason why is that the US President Donald Trump has made it very clear that the US will respond if Iran's regime attempts to shut down these protests with violence. Just the day after the military operation that saw the US oust Maduro from Venezuela, Trump spoke about what's happening in Iran, and in doing so, he delivered a warning that has severely limited the Khamenei regime's options. "We're watching it very closely. If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States," Trump told reporters. And Iran's regime knows that the US president is likely serious. Trump has ordered an airstrike against Iran once before during his second stint in office, so any hint that he would do so again has to be taken seriously by those trying to defuse the situation in Iran. What does that leave Iran with? Very few options, and a bunch of solutions that are laughable at best. In its report on the Iran protests, Reuters says that the combination of the economic crisis plaguing Iran and Trump having previously proven that he will follow through on his threats against the nation has left the Khamenei regime with no cards. As one unnamed Iranian official tells the outlet, the twin pressures have narrowed Tehran's room for maneuver, leaving leaders caught between public anger on the streets and hardening demands and threats from Washington, with few viable options and high risks on every path. Still, Iran searches for solutions. One of the things the Khamenei regime has proposed is an economic relief package that will be put in place on January 10th. You might think that this package would offer the protesting Iranians something big to show them that the regime is working to solve Iran's economic problems. It doesn't. The Khamenei regime's big solution, according to The Telegraph, is an offer of £5.50 or about $7.40 per month in the form of a voucher. That sum is equivalent to about half of an average day's pay in Iran, and it's little more than a band-aid that the Khamenei regime is trying to stick over a gaping wound. With each passing day, inflation means that this money is worth less than it was before, and though this may be one of the most ambitious money distribution efforts that Iran's regime has ever tried to implement, it seems very unlikely that it's going to be enough to stop the protests, even temporarily. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian has at least tried to indicate that inflation won't affect the proposed program. He's also tried to paint himself as someone who understands his people's concerns. Undoubtedly, direct interaction with the people, listening to their concerns, demands, and criticisms, and working to persuade public opinion plays a key role in reducing psychological and social pressures, Pezeshkian said when announcing the offer. But is he telling the truth? And even if he is, Where would the money come from, and what does he expect it to do in the longer term? These are questions that have no real answers. There have also been some vague threats thrown around. Guardian says that Pezeshkian revealed his plan as the head of the Iranian judiciary, Ghulam Hossein Mohseni Eji, tried to throw the regime's weight around. The rioters should know that if concessions were made in previous periods, there will be no more such concessions and appeasements, Eji said as he accused both the US and Israel of sowing the seeds of chaos. These seem like unwise words, given what we've already mentioned about Trump's threats and his willingness to follow through. Eji's comments also seem indicative of an Iranian leadership that is divided on what to do, which feeds back into the comments of a tanker made about internal rivalries potentially speeding up the Iranian regime's demise. For his part, Khamenei is preparing a solution of his own, getting the heck out of Dodge. That's according to an intelligence report shared by an unnamed source who spoke to The Times. That report claims that Khamenei has already hatched a plan to escape from Iran alongside 20 of his family members and aides if Iran's security forces fail to suppress the current protests. The plan supposedly includes the establishment of an exit route out of Tehran should they feel the need to escape, and it would see Khamenei gathering assets, properties abroad, and cash to facilitate their safe passage, the source says. As for where Khamenei intends to go, the intelligence source claims that he has only one destination in mind: Moscow. Right into the waiting arms of Vladimir Putin, he is as likely to want to crush Khamenei in a brutal bear hug as he is to actually be happy about the appearance of Iran's supreme leader on his doorstep. And the reasons why all relate to what we told you at the beginning of the video. The potential collapse of the Iranian regime is very bad news for Putin, because it means that Russia's influence in the Middle East, which has already been damaged by the removal of Bashar al-Assad from the seat of power in Syria, will all but disappear if Khamenei is forced to escape. The Guardian is among several news outlets to highlight just how bad the collapse of Khamenei's regime could be for Putin. Back in June 2025, an analysis written by Piotr Sauer for the news outlet highlighted that cooperation between Russia and Iran has intensified ever since Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Though Russia has stopped short of directly arming Iran, outside of selling weapons to the country, it has happily accepted Shahid drones from the country and has benefited from the work of Iranian instructors who helped Russia figure out how to build its own Shahid copies. A strategic partnership has been formed, and through that partnership, Putin has been trying to build his influence in the Middle East. Russia has also spent billions of dollars in Iran, all of which could go to waste. As Sauer points out, Russia risks losing a key strategic partner, along with years of political and economic capital, in a blow that could seriously undermine its broader geopolitical ambitions. Over the past 2 years, Moscow has become Iran's leading foreign investor, committing billions to gas, energy, and infrastructure projects, all of which could be jeopardized if the regime in Tehran falls. The comments were made right around the time that the US was working alongside Israel to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities into oblivion. You can find out more about that strike, which was dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer, in our video covering what happened. That strike weakened the Khamenei regime to the point where some were suggesting that it might collapse as a result. That didn't happen, though Operation Midnight Hammer will have helped set the stage for the unrest now seen in Iran. Fast forward to the present day, Forbes contributor Melik Kylan says that the same strategic issues that existed for Putin during the summer of 2025 still exist today. The loss of Iran's regime ultimately means that Putin loses a country that serves as a force multiplier for Russia as much in the Caucasus as it does in the Middle East. Kylan notes that the Russian influence in Iran helps Putin to keep the likes of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Chechnya geographically isolated, which is key to preventing other nations making inroads in those countries over which Russia holds great power. This influence is so crucial for Putin that Russia, along with China, which has its own interests related to Iran, can't allow regime change in Iran. And they certainly can't allow a change that would lead to Iran forming anything akin to a Western-style democracy. Putin's problem is that he may no longer have a choice. If the Khamenei regime isn't able to stop the protests, there's no telling what will happen upon the regime's collapse. The US may try to influence the direction that Iran takes, using its own strength along with the proximity of Israel to nudge Iran in the direction of forming a US-friendly government, whatever that might look like. Or the US might sit back and watch Iran descend into a type of chaos that removes the country as any sort of player on the global geopolitical scene. The latter would be preferable to Putin, as a lack of Western involvement could help him get in good with whatever regime comes next. However, Russia's complicated history of propping up Khamenei could be enough to lead to a rejection of Putin, especially if it ends up being people power that sends Khamenei packing. There's also one more thing that will concern Putin as he watches the protests in Iran unfold. It's the one thing that always concerns Putin: money. The growing levels of cooperation between Russia and Iran have allowed Russia's oil companies to start making inroads into Iran's oil fields. That was demonstrated in April 2025, when Al Jazeera reported that Iran and Russia announced an agreement worth $4 billion that would allow Russian oil companies to develop 7 oil fields inside Iran. Such deals allow Putin to gather more money for his Ukraine war chest from a country to which Russia doesn't sell much oil. Iran has oil reserves that World Population Review says amount to over 208 billion barrels, which is enough for the country to not need to purchase much of what Putin is selling. That's why the $4 billion agreement was put in place. If Putin couldn't sell to Iran, he could take advantage of the country's precarious economic condition to ensure that Russia benefits from the vast oil reserves to which Iran is home. Eventually, the money generated from such deals could enter Putin's war chest, and maybe even fund Russia's recovery in a post-Ukraine war world. The fall of Khamenei, assuming that it happens, puts such deals in jeopardy. If an anti-Russian government takes the place of the Khamenei regime, it's unlikely to honor whatever contract was previously signed. It might even encourage Western oil companies to help with oil field development, which would contribute further to the westernization that Putin wants to avoid in Iran. The US would certainly be interested if such deals related to Iranian oil open up, which may offer a hint as to why Trump is telling Iran not to kill anybody during the ongoing protests. America may be eyeing up the possibility of taking a prominent role in a soft regime change that might give it access to oil, along with the type of influence in the Middle East and the Caucasus that Putin has spent so long building. The point of all this is that the potential collapse of Iran's government isn't just about Iran. It's about Russia, China, Israel, the US, and every other nation that sees Iran as much as a tool for control in the Middle East as it does a country in turmoil. Putin's plans to gain influence hinged on the existence of the Khamenei regime. If Iran's supreme leader ends up running away to Moscow, he'll take Putin's vision for the Middle East with him. An Iranian regime collapse would cap a week from hell that has also seen Russia lose influence in Latin America, thanks to the fall of another dictator. Former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has been captured by the US and now awaits trial on charges outside of his own country. That's bad for Putin because he has just lost critical support and may have seen Russia's future war funding exposed. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the protests in Iran. And thank you for watching.